Hey, what's going on guys? My name is Nick and welcome to another episode of Technical. It's the show where Nick talks tech. I'm your host Nick, so let's talk tech. Today we're going to be talking about ISO and why it's so confusing. Usually I like to start these videos off with a definition, but this one gets kind of complicated, so I'm going to give you the less correct but more accessible version of the definition first, and later on in the video we'll discuss it a bit more in detail. While there is a difference between digital and film photography, ISO can be summed up as how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. The higher the ISO value is, the more sensitive your camera sensor is to light, and thus the brighter the image will be, possibly with more noise or grain. Most entry-level cameras won't allow you to change the ISO value at all, but some higher-end cameras or prosumer-level cameras will give you the option to do that. Okay, so let's get into the longer answer now. In film photography, ISO determined how physically sensitive the film strip was to light. High ISO film had larger and coarser crystals to record the light quicker. This is also why ISO can sometimes be referred to as speed. But since these sand-like crystals were often larger, they tended to show up more in the final image. This is also why noise can sometimes be referred to as grain. Much like film photography, in digital photography, higher ISO values can mean that more noise or grain can show up in your image. It may not necessarily be larger grain, but it could be more prevalent nonetheless. The term stands for the International Organization for Standardization. But since modern ISO values are just a culmination of the ASA and DIN standards, we end up just pronouncing it ISO rather than ISO. It doesn't actually stand for anything anymore. The DIN, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce, used a logarithmic scale to determine how sensitive a film strip was to light, while the ASA, the American Standards Association, used a linear scale to determine a film strip's sensitivity. That's much closer to what we use today. Other standards like the Weston or the BSI existed too, but none of it really matters now since we all just use ISO. Also, camera manufacturers don't really adhere to any standards when creating their cameras, which is another reason I think we've dropped the standard from the ISO acronym. We're not calling it I.S.O. if there's no standard. And there are plenty of videos on YouTube already talking about ISO and standards, but this is more of an introduction video. There are two things that can happen when you increase the ISO. Number one, the image is going to get brighter. A change in stops of light occurs at every doubling of ISO values. Typically, a camera's native ISO, or the lowest ISO it can go to, is 100. So doubling that to 200 will double the amount of light in your scene. Some cameras will have a base ISO of 50, which means you can get lower exposures but cleaner images too. And number two, noise can become more noticeable. Like I said before, increasing the ISO can increase the amount of noise in your image. You may not always see it, especially if your image is properly exposed, but it can become more prevalent in, say, shadowy areas. Now that you know where ISO comes from and what it does, we can talk about the more complicated definition. In digital photography, ISO is the measurement of the voltage created when photons of light hit a particular photosite of the camera sensor. In other words, ISO is how much electricity is produced when light hits the camera sensor. Now you may be thinking, oh, that makes sense. The more sensitive you make your camera sensor to light, the more voltage gets created, and thus the brighter the image will be. Not quite. You see, nothing physically changes your camera sensor when you change the ISO values. However sensitive your camera sensor is to light when you open up the box is how sensitive it will always be, unless you hack it. And the voltage that gets created from the light hitting the sensor is the only voltage that gets recorded, regardless of your ISO settings. So what exactly is ISO even doing then? Well, the light that hits the sensor gives off a very small voltage, a millivoltage. After the camera gets a reading from the sensor, the internal computer does an analog to digital conversion, and then saves all the information into a file. Essentially, it takes all the raw voltage information and attaches a number to it. When you change the ISO setting, you're just changing the number that got recorded by doing a bunch of math to it, thus creating a new value for the voltage, which now we're going to call brightness or gain. So in retrospect, you're getting a reading of light at a particular pixel and then amplifying that value, and then doing that same math process for every single pixel in your camera. Super high ISO limits are kind of arbitrary, since it's just a mathematical formula that's changing the exposure of the image. The highest ISO value could be whatever your camera manufacturer decides to make it. Just keep increasing the brightness level until you don't want to do any more math. So here's where it gets even more complicated. There are a bunch of videos on YouTube already talking about whether or not ISO is fake and not actually part of exposure. Since the reading of the voltage is going to be changed after the analog to digital conversion anyway, couldn't you just do all that math in a editing program like Lightroom or Photoshop? And the answer is yes, kind of, but only sometimes. It depends. There are two types of cameras when it comes to ISO values, ones that are ISO variant and ones that are ISO invariant. ISO invariant cameras are ISO-less. They convert the analog light waves to a digital signal very, very well. You can edit these exposures in post without much difference as to if you had just shot the proper ISO in the first place. You can increase your dynamic range without much image quality loss. I'll talk more about dynamic range in another video. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Some of these ISO invariant cameras include the Nikon D750, the Nikon D850, the Sony A7 III, the Sony A9, and a bunch of others. ISO variant cameras lose some of this voltage information, so when you manipulate these images in post, you end up degrading the quality of the image too. You can end up with artifacts such as more grain, decreased color saturation, and less sharp images than if you were to just shoot the proper ISO in the first place. Some of these ISO variant cameras include the Canon 6D, the Canon 6D Mark II, the Canon M6, and a whole bunch of others. Okay, so if the camera is ISO invariant, then you can just change the ISO after the image is taken. In theory, you could just take all of your images at the base ISO and then just edit them after. Technically, yes, but it would be very time consuming, and you wouldn't be able to preview the images while you're shooting because everything would be too dark. Some cameras will have L and H modes, which will allow you to extend your ISO range to lower than its native ISO or higher than the highest ISO value it has. This doesn't change the actual native ISO value, it just does more math. More digital manipulation of that analog signal. Now, if ISO wasn't weird enough, here's where it gets super weird. Even if your camera is ISO invariant, there could still be a step in terms of perceived noise. We could see from this graph that from ISO 100 to 200, the perceived noise in the image increases, as we would expect. And again, increases from 200 to 400. But it then drops down a lot at 800. In fact, it drops down so much that having an ISO of 800 could look cleaner than having an ISO of 400. Every camera is different, so you'll have to test out your camera to see for yourself. I put a link in the description so you can test out your camera's perceived noise values based on its ISO. So that brings us to our big question of the day. Is this important? I think so. Even though ISO can be pretty confusing, it can be a very powerful tool to have in your toolkit. It could be a lifesaver in situations with bad lighting. But remember, every situation is different, and every camera is different too. There's no one magic ISO number that will make your situation look great. And remember, sometimes grainy footage can look good too. Some people may even add noise into their images and videos to make it feel like it was shot on film or from an old vintage TV show, or to make you subtly think that a still image was a video. It's just another creative choice you can make. Well, that's it for this video. Did I leave something out or get something wrong? Let me know in the comments below. I put my sources in the description so you can fact check me. And while you're down there, please go ahead and like the video, ring that bell for notifications, and subscribe so you don't miss another video. See you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Fact. Sometimes shooting in a log profile will change your lowest ISO value to something like 800. Why is this the case? I honestly have no idea. I looked around online for a while but couldn't find anything clear. If you know, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to make another video about this one day.